My mother was buried on a Thursday morning in October. By Thursday afternoon, my brother Gerald had sold her house. I know the exact sequence because Miss Ruth called me at 2:17 in the afternoon, while I was still in the black dress I had worn to the cemetery, sitting in the parking lot of the church where we had held the service, eating a sandwich someone had pressed into my hands at the reception because they could see I hadn't eaten anything that day. "Dorothy," Miss Ruth said when I answered. "Are you somewhere you can talk?" "I'm in my car," I said. "Gerald called me this morning," she said. "Before the service. He asked me to release the property documents for the house on Elm Street." I set down the sandwich. "And?" I said. "I told him I couldn't do that without authorization from all named parties in the estate," she said. "He told me he had spoken to Patricia, and that they were in agreement and that you had been notified." I looked out the windshield at the parking lot of my mother's church. "I had not been notified," I said. "I know," Miss Ruth said, "which is why I'm calling you now, because Gerald found another way. He had documents from the previous attorney, the one your mother used before she came to me, the older version of the will, and he used those to proceed with a private sale that closed this morning. I was very still in my car. This morning," I said. "While you were at the cemetery," Miss Ruth said. Her voice was careful and precise in the way it always was when she was delivering information that required the person receiving it to understand every word. "Dorothy, they sold your mother's house on the morning of her funeral using a will that your mother superseded 6 months ago." I looked at the sandwich in my hand. I put it back in the bag. "Miss Ruth," I said, "is the envelope ready?" "It has been ready," she said, "since the day your mother signed." "Good," I said. Then I started my car, and I drove to the house on Elm Street. "Before I tell you what was in that envelope, I need to ask you something. If you discovered that your siblings had sold your mother's house on the morning of her funeral, using an outdated document without your knowledge, while you were standing at her graveside saying goodbye, what would you do? Would you call the police? Call a lawyer immediately? Break down completely in the parking lot of your mother's church? Or would you finish your sandwich, start your car, and drive to the house on Elm Street with the particular calm of a woman who had been carrying an envelope for 6 months and had always known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this was exactly the kind of moment it had been prepared for? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story is already sitting heavy in your chest, if you have ever been the sibling who was excluded, the child who was overlooked, the person whose name was left off the paperwork until the paperwork mattered, please like this video and subscribe to Still Waters. New stories arrive here regularly, and every one of them runs deeper than you expect. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Let me take you back to the beginning, because the envelope didn't start on the morning of my mother's funeral. It started 67 years before that, in a house on Elm Street in Savannah, Georgia, where 3 children grew up in the particular shadow of a family that had decided, before any of them were old enough to have opinions about the decision, which one of them mattered most. My name is Dorothy Mae Collins. I was born in 1957 in Savannah, Georgia, the second of 3 children born to Mae Louise and Robert Collins in the house on Elm Street that my parents had bought in 1952, with money they had saved for 11 years, and that represented, in the particular way that houses represent things to people who have worked very hard to own one, everything they had built, and everything they believed they were building toward. My father Robert died when I was 9 years old. He died in the way that men of his generation and his work died, of a heart that had been asked to do too much for too long, that had run the particular calculus of physical labor and stress, and the specific pressures of a black man trying to build something in Savannah in the 1960s, and had finally arrived at a number it couldn't sustain. He was 51 years old. He left behind Mae Louise, who was 47, and 3 children, Gerald, who was 13, me, who was 9, and Patricia, who was 6, and the house on Elm Street, which Mae Louise held on to with the particular determination of a woman who understood that the house was not simply shelter, but proof. Proof that Robert Collins had built something. Proof that his death had not undone what his life had made. Proof that his children would grow up in a home that belonged to them, rather than to a landlord who could revoke it. She held on to it for 42 years. Through the lean years after Robert died, when she worked 2 jobs, days at the school cafeteria, evenings cleaning offices downtown, and came home late and still found time to check our homework and make sure our clothes were pressed and our shoes were polished, because May Louise understood that the way you presented yourself to the world communicated things about what you believed you were worth. Through the years when Gerald graduated and went to work at the Postal Service and became, in his own mind and increasingly in May Louise's household, the man of the family, the one whose opinion mattered, the one consulted on decisions, the one who arrived at Sunday dinner and sat at the head of the table that had been Robert's and received the particular deference of a household that had organized itself around his presence. Through the years when I studied accounting at Savannah State and became a bookkeeper and then an accountant and built a career that was, by any objective measure, more financially significant than Gerald's career at the Postal Service. A fact that Gerald acknowledged through the particular silence he used for things he did not want to acknowledge. Through the years when Patricia married and moved to Charleston and came home for holidays with the easy warmth of someone who had always been the family's favorite and knew it and wore that knowledge lightly and without cruelty, the way people wear things they were born into and have never had to earn, I need to tell you about Gerald, not because he is the villain of this story in the dramatic sense. He is not a cruel man. He is a man who absorbed, over the course of a childhood and a young adulthood and a middle age spent as the designated man of the Collins family, a set of understandings about his own importance and authority that were never fully examined because nobody in the family had ever required him to examine them. He was the eldest. He was the son. He had assumed, from the time he was 13 years old and Robert died, that his role in the family was to make decisions, and that making decisions meant he was the one whose judgment was final, including decisions about the house on Elm Street. He had been making decisions about that house for 30 years, not dramatically, not with any obvious overreach, but in the particular way of a person who considers himself the authority, managing the maintenance questions, handling the contracts with the repair services, paying the property taxes from an account he had set up for that purpose, consulting May Louise about her wishes in a way that communicated that he was consulting her rather than asking her, that the consultation was courtesy rather than genuine deference. May Louise allowed this. Not because she was weak. May Louise was the furthest thing from weak, but because she had lost Robert at 47, and Gerald had stepped into the space Robert left, and there was something in the having of that. A son who stepped up, a son who managed things, that she needed, and that she let herself need without fully examining what it was costing the rest of her family. What it was costing was this: Dorothy. I was the middle child, the accountant, the one who actually understood the financial dimensions of everything Gerald was managing and who could see, with the professional clarity of someone who read documents for a living, the places where his management was imprecise or self-interested or simply wrong. I pointed these things out. Gerald did not appreciate the pointing out. The pattern that developed, Gerald managing, Dorothy noticing, Gerald dismissing what Dorothy noticed, was established in my 20s and solidified in my 30s, and was entirely entrenched by the time I was 40, and May Louise was 70, and the house on Elm Street had appreciated to a value that made it, for the first time, genuinely significant as an asset rather than simply as a home. That was when Gerald's interest in the house changed. Not immediately, not obviously, but I noticed, because I always noticed, because noticing was what I did, a shift in how he talked about it, less about maintenance and more about value, less about what May Louise wanted and more about what made sense. The quiet beginning of a conversation about what would happen to the house eventually, framed always as responsible planning and never as anything else. I watched this shift. I noted it. And I said nothing, because May Louise was alive, and the house was hers, and the decisions about what happened to it were hers to make. What I did, quietly and without announcement, was make sure that May Louise understood what the house was worth, and what her options were, and what her rights were, and what happened to property in Georgia when someone died with and without a current will. I did this not by telling her what to do. I did this by being her daughter, by being present, by being available, by answering her questions when she had them, and by asking her questions that helped her understand what she actually wanted, rather than what she had been told she should want. And 6 months before she died, May Louise Collins made a decision. She picked up the phone and called Miss Ruth. Miss Ruth was the kind of attorney that families like ours found through the particular network of trusted relationships that exists in communities where formal institutions have not always been reliably on your side, recommended by someone who had used her, who had been recommended by someone else. The chain of trust running back through the community like a root system. May Louise had gone to her 3 years earlier to update her power of attorney documents. She had liked Miss Ruth immediately, liked her precision, her directness, the way she asked questions that went to the center of things rather than around them. 6 months before May Louise died, she called Miss Ruth again. "I want to update my will," she told her. Miss Ruth came to the house on Elm Street on a Tuesday afternoon, with the documents and the patience and the particular skill of an attorney who has spent 30 years helping elderly clients understand exactly what they want and exactly how to ensure they get it. May Louise told her what she wanted. Miss Ruth documented it. May Louise signed it. And then she called me. "Dorothy," she said when I answered. "Mama," I said. "I did something today," she said. "Tell me," I said. "I went and saw Miss Ruth," she said, "about the house. I was quiet. I fixed it," she said, "the way it should have been all along. I thought about 30 years of watching Gerald manage things, about the particular silence I had learned to keep when he dismissed what I noticed. "Mama," I said, "you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she said. Her voice was very calm, very certain. The voice of a woman who has made a decision she has been considering for a long time and has finally arrived at the moment of making it. I've known for a long time that things weren't right. I just needed to be ready to fix them. I held the phone for a moment. "Does Gerald know?" I asked. "No," she said, "and I'd like to keep it that way. For now." "I understand," I said. "Dorothy," she said. "Yes, Mama?" "I want you to have something," she said. "Something from Miss Ruth, so that you have it when the time comes." "I know what it is," I said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm giving it to you." The envelope arrived at my house in Birmingham 3 days after May Louise's conversation with Miss Ruth. It came by certified mail, which required my signature, which I provided on a Tuesday morning before work, with the particular steadiness of a woman receiving something she has been expecting. Inside the envelope was a copy of the updated will, and a letter from Miss Ruth, brief and precise, explaining what the document contained and what it meant, and what she would need from me if and when the time came to act on it. I read both documents twice. Then I placed them in the envelope. And I put the envelope in the filing cabinet in my home office, beside the other documents I kept. My own financial records, my property documents, the various papers of a life managed with the care of someone who had spent 30 years helping other people understand that the difference between having something and being able to prove you have it was the difference between security and its absence. May Louise died in September, 3 weeks before the funeral. She had been declining for 2 years, the particular slow diminishment of a woman in her late 80s, whose body was finishing its work while her mind remained largely clear. The cruelty of that combination being that she understood everything that was happening to her with a clarity she might have preferred not to have. I was with her for the last week. Gerald came twice. Patricia came once, from Charleston, and stayed for 3 days and was, to her credit, genuinely present when she was there, sitting with May Louise the way daughters sit with mothers when the sitting is what's needed. Gerald, during his visits, talked about arrangements. Not unkindly. I want to be accurate. He was not performing indifference to his mother's dying. But he was also, in a way that I observed with the attention I had brought to Gerald's behavior for 40 years, already thinking about what came next. The conversations he had when he stepped into the hallway to make phone calls had a particular quality I recognized. The quality of a man who has been planning something and is beginning to implement the plan. I said nothing. I sat with my mother. I held her hand. I told her about Savannah, about the neighborhood and the people she had known, and the things that were the same, and the things that had changed. and the way the light came through the windows of the house on Elm Street in the afternoon the same way it always had. She listened with her eyes closed sometimes, and open sometimes. On the last evening, she squeezed my hand. "You have what you need," she said. "I have it," I said. "Good," she said. And in the morning she was gone. I did not tell Gerald about the updated will before the funeral. I want to be honest about this decision because I think it matters. I could have called him the day May Louise died. I could have said, "Gerald, before you do anything about the house or the estate, you need to know that Mama updated her will 6 months ago, and Miss Ruth has the documents and everything needs to go through her." I could have done that. I did not. Not because I wanted to trap him. Not because I was planning anything dramatic. But because I had watched Gerald Collins manage things for 40 years. And I understood, with the professional clarity of an accountant who has seen this pattern in other families, that telling Gerald about the updated will before he had done anything would produce a very different outcome than letting Gerald do what Gerald was going to do, and then producing the updated will. Gerald, informed in advance, would adapt. He would involve attorneys. He would find ways to contest or delay or complicate. He was not unintelligent, and he had resources, and he had spent 40 years understanding how to position himself as the family's decision-maker. Gerald, caught in the middle of something he had already done, would have no position to adapt to. So I drove to Savannah for the funeral with the envelope in my purse. And I sat at my mother's graveside in the October morning and said goodbye to the woman who had held onto a house for 42 years and who had fixed things 6 months before she left, the way they should have been all along. And then I drove to Elm Street. Miss Ruth had told me what Gerald had done and how he had done it. The previous attorney, the one May Louise had used before she found Miss Ruth, had retired, but his files had passed to a successor practice that Gerald had apparently located and contacted. The will in those files was 12 years old. It predated the updated version by 12 years and reflected May Louise's wishes as they had existed before 6 months ago, and before the conversation she had finally had with herself and with Miss Ruth about what she actually wanted rather than what she had been told she should want. Gerald had used that will to authorize himself and Patricia as co-executors of the estate. He had then found a buyer for the house. I learned later that he had been in contact with this buyer for several months, which told me the timeline of his planning in a way that settled into my chest, with a cold and specific weight. He had closed the sale that morning, while I was at the cemetery, while I was standing at the graveside of our mother saying goodbye. I drove to Elm Street. Gerald's car was in the driveway. Patricia's car was behind it. There was a third car I didn't recognize, the buyer's attorney, I would learn. I parked at the curb. I sat for a moment. I thought about May Louise squeezing my hand. "You have what you need." "I have it," I said. I picked up my purse, and I went inside. The door was unlocked. Of course it was. It was my mother's house, the house where I had grown up, the house I had a key to, that I had carried on my keyring for 20 years. I opened it the way I had opened it 10,000 times before, and walked into the front hallway that smelled of May Louise, and 42 years of family, and the particular combination of things that a house accumulates over decades of being lived in. Gerald was in the living room. He was standing with a man I didn't recognize, 40s, suited, carrying a leather portfolio. And with Patricia, who was beside him with the expression she used when she was present for something she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but had decided not to object to. Gerald looked at me when I came in. His expression did several things in rapid succession. Surprise, because he hadn't expected me here. Not this quickly, not this composed. Then the particular recalibration of a man who has been caught doing something but who has prepared, over the course of a long life of managing things, for the possibility of being caught. "Dorothy," he said. His voice was warm. The warmth of a man who has decided that warmth is the appropriate response to this situation. "Gerald," I said. "We were just finishing up," he said. "You should have come to the reception. People were asking about you." "I was here," I said, "getting the things I needed." He looked at my purse, then back at me. The man with the portfolio was watching. Patricia had gone very still. "This is Tom Aldridge," Gerald said. "He represents the buyers. We were just—" "I know what you were doing," I said. Gerald's warmth adjusted slightly. "Dorothy," he said, "I know this is a hard day. It's a hard day for all of us. But the house needed to be settled and you were—" "When did Mama change her will?" I asked. The question landed in the room with a weight that the warmth couldn't absorb. Gerald looked at me. "What?" he said. "The will you used this morning," I said. "The one from the previous attorney. When do you think Mama wrote it?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. 12 years ago, I said. "Give or take." "Dorothy," Patricia said. 6 months before Mama died, I said. She updated it, with Miss Ruth, who has been her attorney for 3 years, and who called me at 2:17 this afternoon from her office because she could not reach the sale in time, but wanted to make sure I knew what had happened. The room was very quiet. Tom Aldridge, the buyer's attorney, had stopped moving. Gerald's expression had changed completely. The warmth was gone. What he had underneath it was something I recognized from 40 years of watching my brother manage things. The expression of a man who is rapidly calculating whether the position he is in has an exit, and finding that the calculation is not producing a satisfying result. "That will is not valid," he said. Finally, his voice was different now. Flat, careful. Mama was not. She was declining. Her mental capacity. Miss Ruth had her evaluated, I said, by 2 independent physicians. 6 months ago, before the signing. Both confirmed she had full testamentary capacity. I reached into my purse. I took out the envelope. I held it where Gerald and Tom Aldridge could both see it clearly. "This," I said, "is a certified copy of the updated will, signed by May Louise Collins on April the 14th of this year. Witnessed, notarized, and filed with Miss Ruth's office the same day. I also have the medical evaluations and the documentation of the filing." I placed the envelope on the table between us. Tom Aldridge picked it up. He opened it. He read. The room was very, very quiet while he read. Gerald watched him read. Patricia watched Gerald. I stood with my hands folded and waited. Tom Aldridge finished reading. He set the envelope down. He looked at Gerald. "Mr. Collins," he said. His voice was professional, precise. The voice of a man who is about to say something that has legal implications and wants to be accurate. "I need to make a phone call." He stepped out of the room. Gerald looked at me. For a long moment, he said nothing. Patricia said, "Dorothy, did you know? Before today?" "Since April," I said. She closed her eyes briefly. "And you didn't tell us," Gerald said. His voice had found a new quality. Not anger, not yet, but the particular precursor to anger of a man who has realized he has been outmaneuvered and is trying to understand how. "No," I said. "Why not?" I thought about the honest answer. "Because," I said, "I have watched you manage things for 40 years, Gerald, and I have learned that when you know something is coming, you find a way to manage that too. Mama didn't want this managed. She wanted it done correctly." Gerald looked at the envelope on the table. His jaw tightened. "That house was going to be sold anyway," he said. "Whatever that will says. The estate has to be settled. The house has to go through probate. This doesn't change." "It changes who makes the decisions," I said, "and how they're made, and whether a sale conducted this morning using a superseded document holds up to legal scrutiny." Tom Aldridge came back into the room. He looked at Gerald. "Mr. Collins," he said, "I've spoken with my clients. Given the existence of a more recent testamentary document, we're going to need to pause the transaction pending a review of the estate documents and the determination of the valid executor." Gerald said nothing. He looked at the envelope. The envelope that May Louise had signed into existence on a Tuesday in April in the house on Elm Street, where she had lived for 42 years. The envelope that I had carried in my purse through a funeral and a cemetery and a parking lot, where I had eaten half a sandwich and driven to Elm Street, with the particular calm of a woman who had been carrying something for 6 months, and had always known that the moment to use it would announce itself clearly. This was the moment, and I had been ready for it. Gerald and I sat in the kitchen of the house on Elm Street for a long time after Tom Aldridge left. Patricia sat with us. Nobody said anything for several minutes. The kitchen was exactly as it had always been. The particular organization of May Louise's kitchen, everything in the place she had determined it belonged. The small rituals of a woman who had cooked in this space for 40 years encoded into the arrangement of every item. Gerald looked at his hands. He had the expression of a man sitting with something heavy that he has just been made to understand he cannot set down by making someone else carry it. "What does the will say?" he asked finally. I told him. The house in the updated will was to be sold. May Louise had not changed that part, because she was a practical woman, and she understood that 3 children who lived in 3 different cities had no practical use for a house in Savannah. But the proceeds of the sale were to be divided equally among the 3 of them, with one specific provision. The provision was this. Dorothy May Collins was designated as the executor of the estate. Not Gerald. Dorothy. Gerald was quiet for a long time after I told him that. I watched him process it. I watched him understand what it meant. Not just for the house, not just for the money, but for the particular story he had been telling himself for 40 years about his role in this family, and his mother's trust in him, and the authority he had assumed was his, because nobody had ever directly told him otherwise. May Louise had told him otherwise, 6 months before she died. She had simply done it in a document rather than a conversation, which was, I thought, sitting in her kitchen in the particular afternoon light, entirely characteristic of her. May Louise had always preferred to let the paperwork speak. She learned that from me, Gerald said suddenly. I looked at him. He was looking at me. The paperwork, he said. She always let you handle the paperwork. You were the one she called when she had questions about documents. Yes, I said. He nodded slowly. And you told her, he said. About the will, about what she should do. I told her what her options were, I said. She made her own decisions. He was quiet for another moment. Then, did she say anything? About why? I thought about May Louise's hand squeezing mine. You have what you need. She said, I told him, that she wanted to fix things the way they should have been all along. Gerald looked at the table. Patricia put her hand over his. And in that gesture, in my sister's hand over my brother's on the table in our mother's kitchen, I saw something I had not expected to see. Not defeat, not humiliation, something more complicated. The particular expression of a man who has been managing something for 40 years and has just been shown, gently and without cruelty, that the managing was not the same as the caring, and who is beginning to understand, in the specific way that understanding arrives when it can no longer be avoided, what that difference has cost everyone in the room. The sale of the house on Elm Street was paused for 6 weeks while the estate documents were reviewed, and the valid will was established, and Gerald and Patricia acknowledged, through their attorneys, that the updated document superseded the one Gerald had used. The buyer was patient. They wanted the house, and they were willing to wait for the correct paperwork, which was, as these things often turn out to be, a simpler matter than Gerald had perhaps hoped in the days immediately following the funeral, when he was still trying to understand whether there was a position to adapt to. There wasn't. Miss Ruth handled everything with the precision I had come to expect from her. The estate was formally opened. I was established as executor. The accounts were reviewed, the property valued, the process put in motion that May Louise had intended when she picked up the phone and called Miss Ruth on a Tuesday afternoon 6 months before she died. Gerald hired an attorney. I expected this and was not troubled by it. Gerald's attorney reviewed the documents and spoke to Miss Ruth's office, and came back to Gerald with the information that Gerald already knew at some level, but had been hoping the attorney might find a different version of. The updated will was valid, the medical evaluations were thorough, the filing was clean, and Dorothy Collins was the executor of May Louise Collins' estate. Gerald called me 3 weeks after the funeral. His voice was different from any version of Gerald's voice I had heard in 40 years. Not defeated. Gerald was not a man who had the vocabulary for defeat, but quieter. The particular quiet of a man who has had 3 weeks to sit with something and has arrived at a version of it that he can hold without the need to immediately manage it. Dorothy, he said. Gerald, I said. I want you to know, he said. That I didn't. He stopped. That it wasn't about the money. Not entirely. I know, I said. I thought. He stopped again. I thought she would have wanted me to handle it, the way I always handled things. I know that too, I said. She didn't, he said. No, I said. She didn't. A silence. Then, do you think she was angry at me? I thought about May Louise in her bed in the last week, about the conversations we had, about the things she said and the things she didn't say. I think, I said carefully, that she loved you, and I think she wanted things done correctly. And I think she understood that those two things could both be true at the same time. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like her." "Yes," I said. "It does." Another silence. Then, "Will you tell me what she wanted? With the money, with the house." What she said. I told him. Not just the legal provisions. He had read those. But the conversation. The Tuesday afternoon. The things May Louise had said, and the way she had said them. Gerald listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She called you." "Yes," I said. "Not me," he said. "No," I said. "Not you." He nodded. I could hear it in the silence. Then, "Thank you, Dorothy, for telling me." "Of course," I said. Patricia called the following week. She was more immediate than Gerald, always had been. The youngest child's directness unfiltered by the eldest child's need to manage his reactions before expressing them. "I should have said something," she said. "When Gerald was making the calls before the funeral, I knew it wasn't right." "Why didn't you?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been saying nothing when Gerald does things that aren't right for 30 years, she said. "And I'm tired of that being the thing I do." I sat with that. "It takes time to change a pattern," I said. "I know," she said. "But Mama is gone now, and Gerald isn't going to be the one who decides things anymore, and I want..." She stopped. "I want to be a sister to you. A real one. Not the one who stands beside Gerald and stays quiet." I thought about 40 years of being the middle child. The accountant. The one who noticed things and was dismissed for noticing them. "I'd like that," I said. "Me too," she said. We talked for another hour. About May Louise. About Robert. Who neither of us had known long enough, but whose presence in the house on Elm Street had somehow persisted through everything. In the way May Louise talked about him. In the way the house was organized. In the particular values that had governed her household for 42 years after he left it. About what came next. Not just for the estate, for us. For 3 siblings who had organized themselves around a set of roles that their mother's death had dissolved, who were now, for the first time, having to figure out what they were to each other without the structure those roles had provided. It was, I thought after we hung up, not the worst beginning. The house on Elm Street sold in December. I was there for the closing. Not Gerald. He attended through his attorney, which was his right, and which was, I thought, probably for the best. Some things are easier managed at a distance, when the distance is honest rather than evasive. Patricia came in person. She stood beside me at the closing table in the offices of the title company and signed the documents and accepted her share of the proceeds with the expression of someone completing a chapter, rather than winning something. Afterward, we drove to Elm Street together. The house was empty. The buyers wouldn't take possession until January, and between the closing and the possession, the house sat the way houses sit when they are between owners, neither fully the thing they were, nor yet the thing they were going to be, suspended in the particular silence of a transition. We walked through the rooms. May Louise's things had been distributed weeks earlier, to family members who wanted them, to the church she had attended for 40 years, to the thrift store that had served her community for as long as she could remember. The rooms were bare in the particular way that beloved spaces become bare, when the evidence of the people who inhabited them has been removed. Present in the architecture, in the light, in the way the floor felt underfoot, but no longer populated by the specific things that had made it home. Patricia stood in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway. "I can still smell her cooking," Patricia said. "I know," I said. "Is that normal? That you can still smell something that isn't there?" "I think so," I said. For a while. Patricia put her hand on the counter. "I'm going to miss her so much," she said. "Me too," I said. We stood in May Louise's kitchen in December with the light coming through the windows the same way it always had, and the smell of her cooking fading in the particular way that things fade when the source of them is gone. Then Patricia turned to me. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Of course, I said. Why didn't you tell me? About the will. Before the funeral, you told me you knew since April. I thought about the honest answer. Because, I said, telling you would have required you to either tell Gerald or keep a secret from him, and I didn't think either of those was fair to ask of you. Patricia looked at me. She stopped. That's very thoughtful, Dorothy. Mama raised us both, I said. She did, Patricia said. And she looked out the kitchen window at the backyard where we had played as children, in the particular way that you look at places you grew up in when you are standing in them for the last time and trying to hold on to everything at once. 2 months after the closing, I did something with my share of the proceeds that I had been thinking about since April. Not immediately. I sat with the money the way you sit with something significant. Not rushing the decision, not letting the presence of it create the urgency that presence sometimes creates. I had spent 30 years as an accountant watching people make decisions about money from urgency rather than intention. And I had learned that the difference between those two orientations was usually the difference between a good decision and one you spent years correcting. So I sat with it, and then I knew what I wanted to do. I opened 3 accounts. The first was a scholarship fund at Savannah State University, May Louise's school, the one she had attended for 2 years before Robert Collins came to a social, and she met him, and the particular direction of her life shifted toward the house on Elm Street, and the 3 children she would raise there. The fund was in her name. It would support students from Savannah studying accounting or business, the fields that had given me the tools to understand what I was looking at when I read a document, to know what needed to be done, and how to do it. The second was a contribution to the church where May Louise had worshipped for 40 years, for the restoration of the educational wing that had been in need of attention for a decade, and that she had mentioned, in her last years, with the particular concern of a woman who understood that the church's ability to educate its community was not separate from the church's spiritual mission, but integral to it. The third account I kept. For myself. Not extravagantly. I had never been an extravagant woman, and I had no intention of becoming one, but with the particular intention of a woman who had spent her career managing other people's money, and who understood now that the management of her own required the same care and the same attention. I told Miss Ruth what I had done. She was quiet for a moment after I told her. Then she said, May Louise would have approved of every one of those decisions. I think so too, I said. Another pause. Then, Dorothy, can I ask you something? Of course, I said. When your mother came to me in April, she said, and I could hear in her voice that she was choosing her words carefully. She told me that she had been thinking about this for a long time, about making the change, and she said that she had finally done it because of something you said. I looked at the window of my home office in Birmingham where I was sitting. What did she say I said? I asked. She said, Miss Ruth told me that you told her that the difference between having something and being able to prove you have it is the difference between security and its absence. I sat with that. That sounds like something I would say, I said. Miss Ruth laughed. It does, she said. She also said that you had been waiting a long time for her to be ready to hear it. Yes, I said. And she said, Miss Ruth's voice was quieter now, that she was sorry it took so long. I looked at the filing cabinet where the envelope had lived from April until October. Tell her. I stopped. Tell her I know, I said. Miss Ruth was quiet for a moment. I will, she said. Gerald came to Birmingham in March. Not with an agenda. He called the week before and asked if he could come. And I said yes. And he drove the 4 hours from Savannah on a Saturday morning and arrived at my house at noon. I made lunch. We sat at my kitchen table the way siblings sit when they are trying to figure out what they are to each other on the other side of something significant. He had brought something. A photograph. Old. The particular color palette of pictures from the 1960s. Slightly faded at the edges. Our parents on the front steps of the house on Elm Street. Young in the way that people are young in old photographs, before the weight of the years that came after. Where did you find this? I asked. In a box, he said. At the house. Before the closing. I thought you might want it. I looked at the photograph. Robert and May Louise in the early years of the house. Before Gerald was born, before any of us were born, just the two of them in the house that Robert had saved 11 years to buy, and that May Louise had held on to for 42 years after he was gone. "Thank you," I said. Gerald nodded. We ate lunch. We talked about things that were not the estate, and not the funeral, and not the envelope, about Savannah, about people we had both known, about the small ordinary things of two siblings who have grown up in the same house and share a common history that exists independent of everything complicated that came after it. At one point, Gerald said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" I asked. "About the scholarship fund," he said, "that you set up at Savannah State." I looked at him. "I'd like to contribute," he said, "if that's all right with you." I thought about 40 years of watching Gerald manage things, about May Louise squeezing my hand, about the house on Elm Street in December, with Patricia beside me and the smell of our mother's cooking fading in the kitchen. That would be all right with me. I said. "Good," he said, and we finished lunch. "There is something I want to tell you about the things our parents leave us. Not the houses, not the money, not the property that gets valued and divided and distributed through the particular machinery of probate and estate law. The other things, the things that don't appear in wills. May Louise left me something that I did not fully understand the value of until I was standing in the offices of a title company in December, watching the house on Elm Street change hands. She left me the habit of attention. The understanding that watching something carefully and recording what you observe is not the same as suspicion or paranoia or the kind of vigilance that exhausts you. It is simply the practice of a person who understands that the world is clearer when you look at it directly and write down what you see. She also left me something more specific. She left me the knowledge that she saw me, not Gerald's version of Dorothy, the middle child, the accountant, the one who noticed things and was dismissed for noticing them, the actual Dorothy, the one she called in April when she was ready to fix things, the one she sent the envelope to, the one she squeezed the hand of in the last week and said, "You have what you need. I want to tell you something about being seen by your mother. It is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the largest things that can happen to a person. And when it happens late, when you are 67 years old and your mother is 89, and the time that remains is measured in weeks rather than years, it does not arrive with less weight for having waited. It arrives, if anything, with more, because you understand, receiving it, everything that was on the other side of it, all the years of the middle child and the accountant and the one who noticed things and was dismissed, all the years of watching from the peripheral chair, and still, she saw me, she fixed it, she called Miss Ruth, she signed the document, she sent the envelope, and she said, "You have what you need. I want to tell you, wherever you are, whatever role your family assigned you, whatever chair you have been given at the table, that you have what you need. Not because I know what's in your purse, but because the fact that you are watching, the fact that you are the person who pays attention and records what you observe and carries things carefully until the right moment, that is not a small thing. That is everything. And the right moment will come. It always does. I want to ask you one last thing before we finish. Is there something you have been carrying? Something you have documented or observed or held on to because something in you understood that the time to use it had not yet arrived, that is waiting for its moment? And do you trust yourself to recognize that moment when it comes? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story found something in you, if it reached the person who has been the accountant, the middle child, the one who notices and is dismissed and keeps noticing anyway, please like this video and subscribe to Still Waters. New stories arrive here regularly. Stories about the women who carry things carefully and the moments when the carrying becomes the using. Those are the stories worth telling. And before you go, where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? Still waters run deep. Thank you for sitting with me in them.